I wish I could tell you we found something mundane in that hospital. Rusty tools, maybe a wheelchair, broken light fixtures. I wish I could say that, but what we found, I still can't explain it. Even now, months later, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear the faint echo of footsteps down the hall. It started on a late October night. My friends Jake, Mia, and I decided to explore the old Ravenwood Hospital on the outskirts of town. Locals told stories about the strange lights people sometimes saw in the windows and the muffled sounds of crying that neighbors swore they'd heard on quiet nights. We weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers. Mia was the one who insisted on going. She'd been working on a photography project about urban decay and wanted to capture something authentic. Jake and I went along more out of boredom than curiosity. We parked by the overgrown lot. The building loomed in front of us, a crumbling giant with shattered windows like empty eyes staring us down. The air was heavy with mildew, decay, and something metallic. I tried not to breathe too deeply as we stepped inside. The interior was worse. The walls were stained with long streaks of black mold, and the tiles were cracked or missing altogether. We used flashlights, the beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. It was dead silent except for our footsteps, which seemed unnaturally loud. The first floor was uneventful. Mostly empty rooms with overturned beds and rusted medical equipment. But as we ascended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the building felt different, like it was holding its breath. The second floor was where we found the first item. It was in what appeared to be a children's ward. Rows of tiny, rusted cribs lined the walls. Mia was taking pictures of the peeling murals, faded with unsettling, almost manic smiles, when Jake called us over. He was holding a small wooden box. It wasn't remarkable at first glance, just old and scuffed. But when Jake opened it, we saw the contents. A collection of human teeth, each one carefully wrapped in a piece of wax paper. Some looked yellowed and worn, others almost pristine, like they'd been plucked straight from a child's mouth. Mia laughed nervously. "Probably some creepy dentist's collection," she said, though her voice wavered. In another room, we found a clipboard still hanging from the foot of a rusted hospital bed. The paper was brittle but intact, listing a patient's name, Margaret Elwood. The file was dated 1976, and under condition, the word unresponsive was circled repeatedly, almost furiously. I flipped to the next page, and my stomach sank. It was covered in strange symbols, rows and rows of jagged lines and spirals, almost like a code. Jake snapped a picture of it, mumbling something about puzzle nerds online. Then there was the doll. It sat on a shelf surrounded by rotting medical books, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. The other eye was black, just an empty socket. But it wasn't just a doll. Someone had taken lengths of surgical tubing and stitched them into its arms and legs. Its body was wrapped in what looked like old hospital bandages, discolored with yellowed stains. I didn't touch it. Neither did Mia. Jake, on the other hand, picked it up and turned it over in his hands. "This is so messed up," he muttered. The final item, and this is the one that still keeps me awake, was in the basement. We shouldn't have gone down there. The stairs creaked dangerously under our weight, and the air was damp, making every breath feel like swallowing cotton. The basement was massive, lined with shelves of broken equipment. But in the corner, there was a metal cabinet. The door was ajar, revealing a set of hospital records stuffed inside. Mia pulled one out, flipping through it, and stopped when she reached the last page. The report detailed a patient's stay at the hospital, patient 093. No name, just the number. It mentioned severe nocturnal disturbances and involuntary vocalizations. At the bottom, there was a note scrawled in red ink, transferred to lower wing. Do not disturb. Lower wing, Jake asked, frowning. I thought this was the basement. Then we saw the door. A heavy, steel thing set into the far wall, almost invisible in the shadows. It was locked, but a broken key dangled from the keyhole, as if someone had tried to open it recently. Scratched into the metal were the words, "They wait." The moment I read the words etched into the steel door, an inexplicable chill crept up my spine. It wasn't just the cold, damp air of the basement. It was something deeper, a kind of dread that felt ancient, alive. Mia shone her flashlight on the scratches, and the beam wavered as her hand trembled. "Do you think someone's down there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's just a door, probably storage or some old maintenance area." But even he didn't sound convinced. He stepped closer and grabbed the handle. The sound of his hand on the cold, rusted metal echoed like a gunshot in the silence. "Jake, don't," I said. Something in me screamed that this was wrong. We shouldn't be here, shouldn't even be looking at this door. But Jake just smirked at me and gave the handle a sharp tug. The door didn't budge. "Well, that's that," he said, letting go. But as soon as he did, the broken key dangling from the lock began to swing, as though an invisible hand had touched it. "Let's go," Mia said quickly, backing away. Her flashlight beam darted nervously around the room, catching shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. "This isn't funny anymore." Jake opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. We all froze as the faint sound of a knock, a soft, deliberate tap, came from the other side of the door. None of us moved. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't random or frantic. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted us to know they were waiting. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by the faintest sound, a low, guttural hum. It wasn't quite a voice, more like the echo of one, resonating in a way that felt unnatural. The sound vibrated in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to turn around and bolt up the stairs, leave this cursed hospital, and never look back. But I couldn't move. It was like the door had a hold on me, pulling me closer with an invisible tether. "Let's go," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. But before we could turn away, the scraping started. The noise came from behind the door, metal against metal, as though something sharp was being dragged across its surface. It started at the bottom and slowly worked its way upward. We all stared, transfixed, as thin, jagged lines began to appear in the steel, like claws raking through it. "What the hell?" Jake began, but then we heard the voice. It wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard before. It was low and layered, as though a dozen people were speaking in unison. The words were garbled, slurred, but they were unmistakable. "Let us out," Mia screamed. Jake dropped his flashlight, and the beam spun wildly, casting frantic shadows on the walls. Without thinking, I grabbed both of them and pulled them toward the stairs. None of us argued. None of us hesitated. We ran. The climb back to the main floor felt endless. The stairs creaked and groaned beneath our weight, and the darkness seemed to press in tighter with every step. By the time we reached the top, we were gasping for breath, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. Jake slammed the basement door shut behind us and leaned against it, his chest heaving. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, but none of us had an answer. Mia was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have." A noise cut her off, came from the basement door. A knock. We all stared, frozen, as the knocking grew louder and more insistent. Then the handle started to rattle. The door, solid wood and reinforced with steel, began to bow inward, as though something massive on the other side was pushing against it. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now?" We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air biting at our skin. Even then, we didn't feel safe. We sprinted to the car, piled in, and sped away, the hospital shrinking in the rearview mirror. None of us spoke on the drive back. Jake gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mia stared out the window, her camera clutched to her chest like a lifeline. I kept looking behind us, half expecting to see something following us down the empty road. When we finally reached my house, Jake parked the car, and we sat in silence for a moment. Then Mia broke it. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" Jake said, though I could tell he was afraid of the answer. "When we were running," Mia said. It said something." I looked at her. "What did it say?" Mia hesitated, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. Finally, she whispered, "My name." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on all of us. I stared at Mia, my mouth dry, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "What?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. "What do you mean it said?" Mia clutched her camera tighter, her knuckles pale against the black strap. She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond us. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "When we were running up the stairs, I heard it," she said. "It wasn't loud, but it was clear." "Mia," she shuddered, hugging herself. It sounded like a dozen voices all tangled together, like they were fighting to say it. Jake scoffed, but there was no conviction behind it. "You probably imagined it." "I didn't imagine anything," Mia snapped, her voice rising. "It said my name, Jake. It knew me." The truth was, I hadn't heard the voice say her name. I could see it in her eyes. She believed it. And deep down, I believed her too. "We need to call," I said finally, "the cops, the city, someone. That hospital shouldn't even still be standing." Jake shook his head. "And tell them what? That some old door scared us? What about the scratches on the door?" Mia shot back. "Or the knocking? The voices? You think that was nothing?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and stared out the window. The car felt too small, too claustrophobic. The silence between us was deafening, filled only by the faint hum of the engine. Then Mia spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "There's more." Jake and I turned to her at the same time. "More?" I asked, my throat tight. Mia nodded, her fingers trembling as she reached for her camera. "When we were in the basement," her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard. "You need to see this." She powered on the camera and scrolled through the images. I stared at the picture of the steel door. The words, they wait stark against the rusted surface. At first, it looked exactly as I remembered it. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were fingers. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, were pale, emaciated fingers curling around the edge of the door. The nails were cracked, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones. It looked as though something was peeking out, just as Mia had taken the photo. "Oh my God." We sat there, the air heavy with fear. None of us knew what to say. Then Jake did something that made my stomach drop. "We're going back," he said suddenly, his jaw set. "What?" Mia and I shouted in unison. "I need to see it again," Jake said. "We left in such a hurry, we didn't really look at the door. What if there's more to it? What if—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head. "Absolutely not. We barely made it out of there, Jake. You think going back is a good idea?" "Look," he said, leaning forward. "If we don't go back, we're just gonna sit here, freaking out about what we think we saw. We need answers." "Answers?" Mia snapped. "You think that thing behind the door is gonna give you answers?" It'll rip you apart if you even try to." She stopped herself, her breath hitching. Jake didn't respond. He just stared at the photo again, his face unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the steel door, the jagged scratches, the fingers curling around the edge. Worse, I heard the voice. The strange, layered tone whispering, "Let us out." Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, half hoping it was Jake calling to say he'd come to his senses. Instead, it was a message from Mia. It was a picture. It was a shot of her bedroom window taken from the inside. At first, I didn't understand why she'd sent it. Just a dark pane of glass reflecting her cluttered room. But then I saw it. In the reflection just behind her was the door. The same steel door from the basement, its scratched surface looming in the shadows of her room. Below the photo, Mia had typed one word: "Help." I called her immediately, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panicking, I called Jake, explaining everything in a frantic rush. "We're going to her place." We arrived at Mia's apartment within 20 minutes. Her car was in the driveway, but her apartment was dark. We pounded on the door, shouting her name, but there was no answer. Jake kicked the door in and we stumbled inside. The place was silent, eerily so. Her camera was on the coffee table, the strap dangling over the edge, but there was no sign of Mia. Then we saw the scratches. They started at the living room wall, deep, jagged marks that cut through the plaster, and trailed down the hall to her bedroom. The door was ajar, and from inside, we heard the faintest sound. A knock. My legs refused to move, but Jake pushed forward, shoving the door open. The room was empty, except for one thing. Against the far wall, impossibly out of place, was the steel door.